Of course, I think Saturday night we all got to set our clocks forward an hour, so it is what it is. Today is our 8th class. We're going to do a review. We're going to go through and do a little bit of a review. For people who are taking it for credit, I will have the test out this week, probably either tomorrow or Wednesday. I wanted to do the review before I sent the test out, so expect to get that. This is what I'd like to do, because I know David is supposed to be, and I'm hoping he's going to get to have his surgery Wednesday, I think. Yeah. I don't want to burden him with sending this to him. He's going to have too much on his plate for us to do that. So if you are planning on taking this, you're taking this for credit, and you need the test on the syllabus, my email is on there. That's for everybody that may be watching this online or reviewing this for tomorrow. Send me an email. Let me know I need a test. I will send it to you. I don't want to bother him with it. Let him recuperate, because I don't know how long it will be for him to get it out, and I don't want him to have to worry about it. So send me an email. Say I need the test. I will send you the test. Send it back to me, and I will grade it, and I'll get you your grades back ASAP. I like to get those done. I like to move on those fairly quickly so everybody gets an idea about what's happening. The test is going to have multiple choice. It's going to have some true or false, and it's going to have a couple of I call them essay questions. They're not. I'm not looking for an essay, but they're I want a little bit of more information on there. Nothing complicated. I'm not. This class is not to drum people out. It's to test your knowledge. So you'll have probably 4 or 5 of those, and then most of the rest of it's going to be multiple choice, true or false. And I might throw some other stuff in there as well, but. Expect to see that tomorrow or Wednesday. Okay, so if you're going to take it for credit, email me. I will send you the test, so David doesn't have to worry about it. All right. Any questions about the test? Yes.
I'm bad with technology. Can I print it out, write on it, and send you a picture?
Sure. No, that's fine. No, I don't want to make it any more difficult than it needs to be. I'll send it to you however you want to do that. And truthfully, I'll have the thing if you want to. I'm going to send it as a Word document. So if you want to answer the questions and erase it and email it back to me, however you want to do it is fine. Okay, just as long as I get as long as the answers that I sent you that you do correspond to the number of the questions. So they wouldn't be going, hold on, I think this is the wrong one. I don't have a problem with that at all. What was asked is if you want to print it out, take it. All right, write all the answers out and then send it back, or take pictures and send it back. That's fine. Okay, that's not a problem for me at all. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
How long do we have to finish?
You have 2 weeks. 2 weeks. I want to give plenty of time. This is not going to be I'm not going to say, okay, give me the philosophical ramifications and blah 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 blah. You should be able to. Unless you want to hold forth on that, that's perfectly fine. But it shouldn't take you very long. Probably about an hour and a half to finish it. I am not going to require a proctor for this one. Okay. Sometimes I will require a proctor. I am giving you this test, and I'm trusting you to be honest and forthright. I don't doubt anybody in here is going to do exactly that. I'm not worried about that at all. So for that reason, I'm not going to require a proctor. There are some classes where I do. This is not one of them, okay? Anybody got any other questions? All right. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our review. Father in heaven, we're thankful for the day. We ask, Lord, that you bless us as we go through our study. We ask that you give us an open heart and open mind to receive your word. Thankful, Lord, for the word and what it means to us today. We ask that you be with those who are sick. We ask that you give them their health back and to be your will. We especially ask that you be with Brother David as he's going to be having surgery on Wednesday. Pray that the surgery is successful and it accomplishes what he hopes to accomplish. We ask that you be with those who may be traveling, maybe on their way here. Keep them safe as they travel. And be with us, Lord, as we leave this place later this evening. Keep us safe as we go back home. Most especially, Lord, we thank you for your Son, Jesus, and it's in his name we pray. Amen. All right, we're going to do a review. We're going to start back at the very beginning. If you want to grab your notes out, we're going to go all the way through to where we stopped. And then if we have a little bit of time, we'll get into a couple of chapters as we finish up this evening. And if we get done a little early, we'll go home a little early. That sounds good to me. All right. So from the very beginning, the idea of who wrote the book. Traditionally understood to be, who wrote the book? Moses. Very good. He also wrote Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. If you ever want to do a really interesting study, look and see the scholarly writings on this. And of course, many of them will say Moses was a figurative person. He is a composite of many different people, and the idea of one person writing all of this is foolish. It didn't happen that way, and the idea of Moses doing this was it didn't happen that way, and lots of different people wrote it, and that brings us into our very next point, right? First 5 books called the Pentateuch, right? Meaning 5 books or 5 writings. This is the documentary hypothesis. We talked about that, I think, the first night, JEDP hypothesis. This group, and this is not a formal group, this is a group of people who have read and studied and looked at it, have come to, in my opinion, it's certainly a misunderstanding of it. These are the folks who believe that one person didn't write it. It was written by different authors over thousands of years after the fact. The J stands for Yahwists, as in Yahweh. They produce those portions where God is referred to as Yahweh. Very good. There you go. Shout it out. All right. Then you have the E. These are the Elohists. They produce those portions where God is referred to as Elohim. Then you have D. This is a group who supposedly produced Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy. Probably the book that we read about in 2 Kings 22, where Josiah, they find a book of the law in a storeroom. They bring it out. He says, this is a book of the law. Where has this been? Well, it was either misplaced or, which is, I think is even more probable, they didn't want the kings to find this book of the law. You had people working behind the scenes. They didn't want him to find this book of the law, so they hid it. And then now they brought it out. And he says, dust it off and take a look. And then he realizes we have been in grave error for years and years and years and years. Okay, so excuse me. The D is the group who supposedly produced Deuteronomy. All right? And then P, you have a group of priests that composed a code of holiness for the people, likely during the exile in Babylon. Try to get them back to what they used to be. So, this is the reason that we're here. We were engaged in this kind of behavior, this kind of behavior, this kind of behavior, and this kind of behavior. This is wrong. This is what we're supposed to be doing, which would likely refer back to the book of Leviticus. All right. So this is notice it says documentary hypothesis, and even the people who adhere to this admit that it is a hypothesis. There's no way of proving it. So you can take that for what it's worth, which is not very much. All right. All right, the evidence to the contrary, not that the JEDP was correct, but that Moses wrote the book, or 5 books. The evidence that he wrote the Pentateuch, or Torah, is actually kind of overwhelming. Archaeological research, one of the things that they said, well, writing wasn't really known, especially amongst the Hebrews back in those days, but that's not the case. There's ample evidence that writing was fully known by these people, and it was employed by these people, all right? The JEDP hypothesis assumes that the Israelites waited many centuries after the foundation of their nation before they committed any of their history of laws to written form, but that's not the case. Their neighbors did, they did as well. Okay, their writing was fully formed, and they were able to use it. The one thing about Hebrew that is a little bit different from the other languages that were employed, the Semitic languages that were employed. Hebrew is actually a very simplistic language as far as the makeup of it. If anybody's ever taken Hebrew, it's not necessarily the easiest to learn and the easiest to remember, but the style of writing is very simplistic. There's no vowels in it. It's all consonants. So what you do is it's written down with consonants, and you look at the context to determine what vowels should be where they're supposed to be. So, for example, if you said, if the same word would for chair might mean also rhinoceros, and I'm being a little bit ridiculous with this, but you look at this word, say this word, let's just say this word das, D-A-S. It could mean chair or it could mean rhinoceros. It would be fairly simple in the context to determine what that word would be. Okay, so that's a little bit of an interesting thing about the Hebrew language. And I encourage you, take a look at it sometime and see if you can decipher a little bit of it, and maybe learn to read a couple of the words. It's very interesting language, and I really wish I paid more attention when I was learning it. All right, also evidence to the contrary, the author, which would of course we understand to be Moses, is obviously an eyewitness of the Exodus from Egypt. He is familiar with the geography, the nations that they are marching through, the peoples, the landscape, everything like that. All right, so he uses several Egyptian words that he, of course, would have learned while they were sojourning in Egypt, and refers to customs that go back to the 2nd millennium BC. That would fall right in line with what we're talking about. Another bit of evidence, the Pentateuch claims in many places that Moses was the writer. The Bible is one of those few instances where the Bible proves itself. So if the Bible says something, it automatically proves itself, because it doesn't. It would be different if the Bible contradicted itself in areas, but it doesn't. Okay, the Bible does not contradict itself, no matter what the skeptics might like to claim. Has anybody ever read the Skeptics Annotated, or perused the Skeptics Annotated? I'm not encouraging you to do that, but it's very interesting. What people want to claim is a contradiction in the Scriptures. They look at specific words and they say, this doesn't make any sense, it directly contradicts this, but if you look at it and you do even the littlest bit of work, the littlest bit of research, you can figure out very quickly that the Bible does not contradict itself. All right? But in many places, Exodus 17, Exodus 24, Exodus 34, Numbers 33, Deuteronomy 31, 22, and 24, all of these refer to Moses as having written the law and written these words. Okay? In the New Testament, Jesus frequently spoke of Moses' writing, so if we are going to take Jesus' words at face value, which we certainly should, deeper value as well, but if we simply look at it as Jesus said, it doesn't matter if we want to go any deeper with it. If Jesus said it, then it's accurate. Simply as him being an eyewitness, simply as him knowing this information. You may want to get it, you may not, there may be other ways of, like theologically and philosophically looking at the words of the Pentateuch, but if you simply look at Jesus saying, Moses said this, whether or not it's true, did Moses say it? Yes, he says very specifically, did you not hear? Did you not read? Have you not heard? Moses, 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 Moses. Matthew 8, Mark 7, Luke 24, and John 5. And he even says that those who hear not or reject Moses' writings, Moses' law, would not be persuaded, though one rose from the dead. I think that's pretty strong. A pretty strong claim to make, and of course Jesus has every right to make that claim, right? Luke 16. All right. Anybody have anything? If you want to add or you need some clarification, raise your hand so I can call in you. I don't want to go so fast that we don't get through, or that we don't get people to be able to say what they need to say. I'm not going. This has nothing to do with the test, but I just thought this was interesting. The computer analysis for those who are just like science heads. That, you know, what does the science say? What is mathematical probability? This is an 82% probability that the book has just one author, which would, even if it weren't Moses, it would kind of throw a monkey wrench into that JEDP hypothesis, wouldn't it? If you have one author, 82% probability, putting all of those words in, trying to determine if one person could have written all of those things in the same manner. So I thought that was kind of interesting. All right. Anything about the idea of the authorship of the book? All right, let's look at this. The names of God. Number 1 is Elohim. Genesis chapter 1. Moses uses the word Elohim for God. This is the plural of the word or the term El, which corresponds to God in English. And one of the things I think sometimes difficult, and I got into a discussion with somebody and they just absolutely refused to believe that language had anything to do with it. And they asked me this question about, tell me where you find the word John in the New Testament, the name John. And I said, okay, well, for one thing, John is in the English translation of the New Testament. But if you go to the Greek, it's not John, it's something else. And all of these names are written first in Greek, and then many times they're translated back into Hebrew. They come from a Hebrew background, and then they're translated in English. It doesn't mean that the New Testament is incorrect, simply because the word John, or the name John, is not found there. It's something else. It corresponds to a Hebrew name that was translated into Greek and then translated in English. For example, Jesus. Jesus is not in the original text. Yeshua is, but Jesus is not. And Yeshua is a transliteration of Joshua. So you look at that and you think about, well, okay, that makes a little bit more sense. That makes a little bit more sense. So El, which corresponds to God in the English, Theos in the Greek, and Deus in Latin. What's the language that is not a biblical language? Is it Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, or Latin? Latin. Latin is not a biblical language. Now, some translations said that the sign above Jesus was written in Latin, but Latin is not a biblical language. It's an ecclesiastical language that was introduced much later when the word started to be translated into other translations. All right. Elohim means the strong one. It stresses the awesome omnipotence and power of the God who is creator and ruler over all nature in the universe. All right. So it's the plural of El, which means lends itself to the understanding that what about God? There's something about God, isn't there? He's not one personality. He's not one person. He's multiple. We understand three. He's three in one. And we're not going to get into the philosophical aspects of the Holy Trinity, but it very much, Elohim gives us the understanding that even God does not refer to himself singularly. It's in the plurality. All right? At least not in this particular portion of Scripture. All right? All right, we already talked about this. Don't need that. Yahweh, Jehovah, second name for God. Genesis 2, from verse 4 on, Moses adds the Hebrew term Yahweh, as in Lord God. Okay? Elohim Yahweh. Yahweh is often transliterated as Jehovah. Again, do we see Jehovah? No, but we see Yahweh. It's a transliteration. We can't get too bent out of shape, and when people want to throw that out there as some sort of a contradiction, we can rightly dismiss it because they don't know what they're talking about. I'm not trying to be rude, but they simply don't understand the idea of language. Okay? For example, in my name, if I were to go south of the border, Charles is, or when I was taking Spanish, guess what they called me? They didn't call me Charles because we had to pick a Carlos. Exactly. Carlos. Does that mean my name's not Charles? No. But for my Spanish-speaking friends, I was Carlos. There's nothing wrong with that. All right? Usually spelled Lord in large and small capitals. You'll see that. And I always wondered as a kid, I never really understood that idea of the capital L and a capital O-R-D, but they're all in capital letters, but some of them were smaller. All right, there's the idea of the tetragrammaton, the idea of four. There's four letters. Tetra, meaning four. All right, it's the most commonly used term for God in the Old Testament. Look at that, 6,800 times. Over 6,800 times Jehovah is used. Okay. Yahweh is the truly personal name of the living God, and it was revealed to Moses in Exodus 3, verses 13 through 15. So when he went back and he began to write, he looked at what was going on at the time, and he used the appropriate name for God at the appropriate time in his writings. It means, I am who I am. And of course, we read that. He asked God, when I go back, they're going to ask me who sent me. And what am I to say? And God said, you tell them that who sent you? I am sent you. That's one of those things that honestly, when you read that, and if you're really thinking about it, it kind of makes the hairs on the back of your neck kind of stand up. You realize this is God affirming himself. You know, I can't affirm myself. God can affirm himself. He can swear by himself. Now, he can promise by himself. A lot of people don't like the word swear, but you don't understand what I mean. He can affirm by himself. I can't do that. I always have to look at something external. But he says, I am who I am. I tell them I am sent you. All right? The idea of the self-existent one. Before creation, and he's an eternal being. He's an immortal being. All right? Let's see. We've already talked about this. This idea, though, that Moses in chapter 2, he's describing God's very intimate and personal relationship with the first human parent. This is the idea that God is a loving God. God is a caring God. God provides, right? He gives everything that's necessary. He makes sure that as these two people are living in the garden, that all of their needs are taken care of. And I don't know if we discussed this, but the idea that Adam was somehow some sort of layabout, some sort of a lazy person. No, he had a job to do. But in exchange for him doing that thing, God made sure that everything he did produced. So he says, I want you to dress the garden. So that means he didn't just lay around. I think sometimes we see this where Adam and Eve just sort of laid around and plucked things from the tree and never did the lick of work, and that's not the case. God gave him work to do. He said, mankind is not designed to be lazy. Mankind is not designed to be a layabout. There's something that you're supposed to be doing. In regular existence, in our regular lives, also in our spiritual lives, we are not designed to be lazy people. We're not designed to sit around and say, well, the preacher will do that. Well, the elders will do that. The deacons have their job to do. My job is to show up on Sunday and put my collection in the plate. And Lord said, you don't understand. All right? You have a job to do. All right? So the idea of Elohim, this is Elohim, the supreme creator, is Yahweh, the one who is intimately concerned to maintain a personal relationship with those who will walk and talk with him. All right, the account of creation. Anybody got anything about the names of God? Anything they want to add or have questions about? Okay, all right. Chapter 1, verse 5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. The idea, the Hebrew word here is yom. You might see that on the test. So you might want to put a star next to that. That's the Hebrew word yom. It means day, and it literally means 24-hour day. Unlike the theistic creation or theistic evolutionists who believe that the days in Hebrew, the days in Genesis could correspond to millions of years, the word that's used is yom, and the word yom means literally a 24-hour day. Every time it's used, it means a 24-hour day. So if we look at this in a literal fashion, when God said the first, when the light and the dark, that composed the first day, we got to remember, when he says light and dark at the very beginning, he's not talking about the sun and the moon and the stars. He's talking about the idea of the concept of lightness and darkness. All right? So that's the first day. If we look at it literally, it means that's the first 24-hour day. The next day, when he created this, and this, that's a 24-hour day, so forth and so on all the way through. But you've got folks that they will absolutely put the stop to that. I can give you a couple names of some guys that are New Testament Christians, but they genuinely believe that there is theistic evolution going on. God set it into motion. He spun it a specific way. I think that makes no sense because God is a God of order, right? Things are to be done decently and in order. And the idea that he says, I hope it turns out the way I want it to. And just sort of spun it off into the universe and hoping that it's going to turn out the way that it does just doesn't make any sense in the understanding of our knowledge of the nature and the attributes of God. That's just not how God is. All right. Chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make mankind in our image, imago Dei, after our likeness. So the intention, it was always the intention for male and female. That's interesting. Because women are made in the image of God as well. It's not just man, it's woman. So there's something other than our mere physical characteristics that make us in the image of God. Although there is something to be said for who do we look like? Who do we resemble? I don't know what God looks like. Could God resemble us? He could. I don't know though. And I'm not about to say that he does. But there's a reason he says after our image, after our likeness. Okay, so there may be something to the idea that while he may not have a physical body as we do, there is some sort of resemblance between us and him. I don't know. We'll find out eventually. We're all going to find out at some point. We're all going to realize what he looks like, and if we can even comprehend what he looks like. The idea that we can't see him is the idea that his power is his being is so majestic that we cannot look upon him and live. But that's going to change, right? Because we're going to lose this physical body. We're going to have a spiritual form in some way, shape, or form, and we will be able to look on him in his majesty. All right? So this may be one of the essay questions. Why are we here? Did anybody think about that after this class was over? Why are we here? All right, I'm going to give you I give you all of these answers down here at the bottom. All right, all this stuff right here. I believe that God created mankind to live with him for an eternity. I think that's why he created us. Now we say, is God lonely? No, well, God has plenty of company up there. He doesn't need us to keep him company. The question, why would he create us to live with him for an eternity? Well, there's some things about God's mind that we don't understand, right? We think about this. Why does a husband and wife want to have children? There's something about, there's a drive there that drives us to procreate. And, you know, for most, some people don't want children, that's fine. But by and large, most people, when they get married, it's not too long before the talk starts. The talk starts about, well, when are we going to have children? Well, why do we need to have children? Sometimes we can't even explain it. We can't even explain it. I asked when my wife, we started having that discussion, she brought up that discussion. I said, well, you know, why now? And there was something in the back of her mind. There was something very, very natural about it, and it was I'm trying to think of the right word. It's a natural inclination, but we try to foist that off on God. Did God need us? No, I don't know if He necessarily needed us, but He wanted us. He wanted us. And the default is that we would be with Him. That's the default. The problem is, when given the opportunity, we will sin. So God needed something. He says, you can't come before me with sin. You can't come before me in that state. So what did He say? There has to be some sort of propitiation for that sin. And He set in motion this course through which there would be a Redeemer for mankind. His death on the cross went backwards. It washed backwards and it washes forwards. So He wanted us to live with Him. Through our sin, we gave up that right to do so. And God said, I know that you're going to do this, and you need something that's going to bring you close to me again. And therefore, He set in motion the idea of the Messiah coming. All right, that's just my opinion. I think it's a fairly good one, though. All right, let's do this. Chapter 2, verse 7. Adonai Yahweh formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature. Now, we think about what was breathed into the man. Was it simply life? Or was it a part of God in that soul came into his being? The Hebrew word is ruach, which is wind or spirit. So the question is, before that breath went into Adam, what was he, essentially? He was clay, right? God put something together, but he was not a living, breathing creature until God breathed that breath of life into him. So we got to ask that question, was the same breath given to the animals? We don't read that where God breathed the breath of life into the animals. Was the breath of life given to the woman? We don't read that it was, but it's fairly evident that it was because of her ability to correspond with Adam and to be the kind of helpmeet that Adam needed, not like one of the animals. She was different than the animals, like Adam was different from the animals. All right. Oh, Adonai, I forgot to say, Adonai, the word Adonai literally means the many-breasted one. Many-breasted one. And breast, exactly what you're thinking. The idea of the breast being able to provide life to a small child, to a baby. Absolutely. And it's the concept that God is self-sustaining. He's a self-sustaining being. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't take nourishment. He doesn't need the sunlight. He doesn't need anything. He doesn't need the oxygen. He doesn't need anything else. He is self-sustaining. I forgot to put that in there. That won't be on the test because we really didn't go over that, but I thought I might throw that in there. Okay, God creates a garden. There's Eden, and then God creates in a portion of Eden, He creates a garden. And He created that garden for the man and his wife, or the man and the woman, which of course was his wife. He takes them and He puts them there. I don't know how He does that, if He just magically transports them from here to there. He picks them up by the scruff of the neck and drops them off. I don't know. But it says He took him and He placed them in the garden. And this is a place where Adam would live and act as a steward. He was to tend the garden. He was a dresser. He dressed the garden. All right? And well, as we said earlier, man was not to be an idle creature, but was meant to work from the very beginning. We see that Paul confirms it in 2 Thessalonians 3, doesn't he? We're supposed to work. Right? Earn our living. All right, man named all the animals as God brought them to him. There was not found a helper that was suitable. All right. Why were none of the animals a suitable helper for Adam? You'd think it'd be fairly simplistic, but why were none of the animals suitable for Adam? Nice.
I would say procreation. They wouldn't be able to have children.
That's certainly one aspect of it. They are certainly not suitable for having children. There is no cross species, right? And I don't know how, not to get too detailed into that, but I don't even know how that would work in many cases.
Well, a cow can't talk to you. So, like I'm saying, if you need help and you need a helpmate,
okay,
you need someone that can express your feelings, that understands you. I mean,
Yeah.
there's a lot of other things.
I mean, I've seen lots of animals that are very well trained, aren't they?
Yeah.
They can, seeing eye dogs. I watched a whole documentary on seeing eye dogs. I love that kind of stuff. So I sat there and watched it, and it was just fascinating how they train these animals. Not just seeing eye dogs, but all kinds of service animals. This is a guy that has cerebral palsy, or this is a person who has this, and that dog can do, or other animal can do all kinds of things. But at the end of the day, what has to happen? That dog has to be specifically trained, and that dog can't really understand a lot of that. He just has very, very, very good training. But you're right, they can't understand one another. My dog loves when I come into the room, but my dog can't understand when I talk to it. All right, he just sort of gives that kind of this type of thing. I'm explaining all this stuff, and the dog just sort of sits there and, when are you going to throw the ball? That's all I care about. When are you going to give me a treat? That's all I understand. So you're right, they can't understand we can't understand one another. Yes, sir. Ma'am, sorry.
Animals aren't Imago Dei. They're not made in the image of God.
No, they're not. They're not made in the image of God. And I tell you what, I got into trouble with a young lady one time, and she asked me, is my dog going to be in heaven with me? And I said, you know what, look, if you're asking me to somehow confirm that for you, I'm not going to do that for you. And she was very upset that I would not tell her that Fluffy would be with her, waiting for her at the gates. It's not like it ruined our relationship, but she was kind of upset that I wouldn't or couldn't do that. The truth is, I can't. When we die, what happens to us? Our body goes back to the ground, but what happens to our spirit? It goes to God. Has God given that spirit to the animals? Now, before we say anything, if you go back and you look at some of those extraneous writings, the life of Adam and Eve, and I'm trying to remember the other one where it gives the understanding that at one point the animals understood speech, they could converse with humans, and God took that away because of the sin of the serpent. I caution you about reading that stuff with any kind of, and looking to it as accurate. But it goes to show that even then people wanted to write that, yes, the animals can understand. There's something about them that's different. No, that's not what we find. It is not what we find. All right? So I think we got a pretty good understanding. There's a reason that there was no helper found suitable for Adam, so God said, I'm going to create one. We also need to be careful that this is not somehow God realized his big mistake and said, oh, I forgot. No. God knew. And what he did is, I think it's interesting that when God paraded, because he said God brought the animals and presented them to Adam, didn't he? That's what it says. He says, as he presented them, Adam named them in such a way that made sense to him, that he could comprehend, and that would make sense in the language that he spoke. But it says that there was not a helper found suitable. Who discovered that? It wasn't God. God knew there wasn't a helper that was suitable. Who realized that there was not a helper that was suitable for him? Adam did. But God had to show this. Look, these are the animals. He's like, well, none of them look like me. None of them respond the way, I'm talking to them and they don't talk. None of this. Okay? So Adam understood, because of that presentation of all these animals, that there was not a helper that was found suitable for him. All right? Remember that term, Ezer Kenegdo. Ezer Kenegdo. Just remember that term, suitable helper, if you're taking the test. All right? The concept in Genesis 2 is one of a superior position, offering assistance to someone who cannot help themselves. All right? I want you to think about that. We had a discussion about this. Compare that to how God saw the creation of woman, to how women were at that point in time, and often, sometimes today, are treated. We have to be very careful in the Lord's church that we don't fall into that trap of saying women are not suitable, they don't have value. I don't think we find that as much today, although there still are some folks that are desperately working from antiquated thinking. Women absolutely 1,000%. In many ways, they are superior to men in certain things. Now, here's the thing. When it comes to the idea of being in charge of the family, or acting as stewards of the Lord's church, in the sense that the elders are acting as stewards of the Lord's church. God says it doesn't matter if they are good at it. It doesn't say that they may have a superior way of thinking or looking at particular things. He says the job, men, is yours. You cannot abdicate that responsibility. You don't have the right or the obligation to say, well, we can't find any guys to do this, so what we're going to do is we're going to find some suitable women, some women with some real talent, and we're going to install them as elders or deacons or whatever. We do not have the right to do that. God said, this is a job that I've specifically given to men to do. And unfortunately, we have a lot of congregations of the Lord's church who have said, well, yeah, but, we don't have any men, but we've got some really talented women. And God said, that's not what concerns me. This is your job. If you're not good at this, if you're not qualified, get qualified. You need to lift yourself up. You need to start training and learning so that you can do the job that I've given you to do. But at the bottom here, man was in a position that was untenable. He could not do what God wanted him to do without someone who could do something to help. He says, be fruitful and multiply. Man could not do that by himself. He needed a woman to do it with. Not just in the physical act of copulation and having children, but the idea of having a family and running a family. God always designed it with two people in mind. It doesn't always work that way. It doesn't always turn out the way we want it to. But that's the format, right? That's the pattern that God set into place. All right? Woman was complementary. She crowned creation. She crowned creation. That was you notice that's the last of the big creation, isn't it? Created man, created animals, and then he created woman. I like that. She's like the crown that sits on top of creation. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. All right, any questions so far? All right, God presents her to Adam. Here she is. She looks a little different than the animals, doesn't she? I imagine Adam's like, yeah, much better. I saw all these animals, and not one of them looked good to me, but she looks much better. I like this. And I imagine Adam was probably very thankful. He said, I've got someone who's made like me. I see a resemblance. There are certain things that are not, but I see this resemblance. She walks upright like me. She has a head of hair like I do. She has 2 legs. She stands on 2 legs. Everything about us is corresponding except for some very important differences. But by and large, this is someone this is a helper. This is a helpmeet that's suitable. All right? He presents her to Adam, his wife, begins the divine institution, the first of the divine institutions, right? Family, government, and church. That's how it starts. All right, so this is the first of the divine institutions. And I like this because it's an interesting choice from God. He says, be fruitful and multiply. If mankind was making the decision, we would probably say, look, here's a bunch of men, here's a bunch of women, just be indiscriminate. Be sexually indiscriminate. We just want numbers. That's all we're concerned about, but that's not what God had in mind. He says, I want one man and I want one woman, and I want them to be joined together for life. For life. Or until one of them, for life until one of them passes. That's the pattern, that's the program. Why wouldn't God just encourage open relationships and indiscriminate sexual activity? It's because not only is he a God of order and decency, there's a relationship that he is alluding to that's going to come about later on down the road. And it even mentions that. This mystery is profound. But I say to you that it corresponds to Jesus and the church. All right? All right, let's move on. There it is. Ephesians 5:32. All right, the serpent asks if God really said it. He says, well, God said that we're not supposed to eat of this tree. And the serpent says, did God really say that? Well, Genesis chapter 2, verse 16 tells us that he did actually say that. If God says it, then he means it. It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't something to be taken lightly. God tells us that he did in fact say it. He did in fact say that. What was the serpent? Was it Satan? Was it a snake under the control of Satan? We talked about all this. We're kind of just walking back through it. Was it simply a delusion sent by Satan? Were the man and woman wrong to talk to the serpent? And this is the important one. What kind of message do we get from the serpent's punishment? What sort of message do we get from the serpent's punishment? Anybody take notes on that? What did we say? What sort of message do we get from the serpent's punishment?
I have a sense of modesty and consequences for actions.
All right. There's a consequence for actions, isn't there? Doesn't matter if they were confused. Doesn't matter if they were misguided. Doesn't matter if they were tricked. The concept here is that something was said not to be done, and they did it. Now, if they had heard from God Himself, if God Himself had come down and said, "Hey, listen, I've changed my mind. You can have that tree," they would have been perfectly entitled to eat from that tree. God said, "Don't eat from this tree," and they did. They listened to someone other than God. That's the big problem. They listened to someone other than God. Isn't that a problem we find all the time, right? Rather than listening to God, we listen to what some man's written in a book or a commentary, what some eldership has gone and studied themselves into error. Saw that the other day. Congregations decided that they're going to introduce some things that are not, we don't find in New Testament worship. And they're going to do that. And what they said was that the elders and the preacher went on a weekend-long retreat and studied the scriptures really, really closely. And they have come to the conclusion that this, that, and the other. My question is, like, how after thousands of years of doctrinal accuracy, in a 3-day weekend, they've discovered something that's completely different, and they realize that we've been in error for all of this time. And then they couch it saying, we're not saying that other people are wrong for not doing this. What we're saying is that we've determined that it's not wrong to do this. All right, so what does it say? All right, now listening to God. What was likely, not firmly believe this is the case, the preachers determined that he wanted to do something, and he got the elders and again, convinced them of something otherwise. And you had weak men who were led by a guy that simply wanted to do something that he thought would be good for, the congregation, be good for numbers. Sometimes that's the case. All right. Anybody got anything they want to add to this? All right, let's move on. We already talked about this. The idea of Satan as an accuser. The serpent was more crafty. He said, God actually say, Satan is certainly an accuser. He's known as an accuser. Job 1:11, he accuses Job. Is Job just simply doing, that Job is simply doing this because you've built a hedge around him. You've never allowed anything to touch him. In Revelation 12:10, the accuser of our brethren. Satan is just that. He is an accuser. He hopes to weaken our faith by being an accuser. And helping us and encouraging us to be accusers as well. That's one of the things Satan loves to do. He will do that himself as we read in Scripture, but one thing he loves to do is get us to do the same thing. He wants us to be accusers as well. He's not content with just himself being in sin and error. He wants us to be as well. All right, we got the fall of man. Remember, she looked at the fruit. She looked at the tree. She saw that the fruit was a delight to the eyes, that it was good for food, and it was desired to make one wise. These are the three methods in which we are all tempted. The three methods in which Adam and Eve were tempted. They fell. Adam fell. But we also read that Jesus went, and after he was tempted, or after he was fasting for 40 days, that he was tempted. Remember, he was led away into the wilderness to be tempted. Okay? So he was tempted with the three temptations, and that's the beautiful thing. Where Adam failed, Christ succeeded. And even says that. He was tempted in all ways such as man is tempted, yet he did not sin. So is it wrong to be tempted? No, Jesus was tempted. If we're in error for being tempted, then Jesus is in error for being tempted. But we're not in error for being tempted. I mean, driving here on I-20, I was tempted 200 times. Here's this guy going, in the middle lane going 45 miles an hour where people are just zipping by him. I was tempted to pull up alongside of him and roll down my window and say, get moving. I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not my responsibility. So I went around him and kept going. Yes, I was tempted. But that's not the error. The error is when we give in and we sin when we're tempted. And something can be said of also putting ourselves in a place where we can be tempted. Although I still think that's a very gray area that we're somehow in sin because we are in a place where we might be tempted. And I'm not going to get into that, but if you want to think about that, that's fine. It won't be on the test. All right, consequences of sin. What does he do? Right? There's three people involved. There's the man, there's the woman, and then there was the serpent. And each of them had a very specific condemnation and punishment for their sin. Not for their temptation, but for their sin. All right? But anyway, there's the consequences for that. Why didn't they die? Why didn't they die?
God had mercy on his creation.
Exactly. God had mercy. All right? What is the punishment for sin? Death. So, in that, are you glad that God is a merciful God? Man, I'm glad He's a merciful God. The only the natural punishment for sin is death, and God said, "But I don't want you to die. So I'm going to send you something where you don't have to die if you're in sin." Aren't you glad God doesn't punish us with that immediately? Man, I'm so glad. Now we see more cases where God punished people immediately for sin, but that's not what He does. That's not what He does. It's in His nature. He's not willing that any should perish. All right? And that's all in class 1. All right, here we go. Cain and Abel, 2 people were born, right, to Adam and Eve. 2 people were born, one is a farmer, one's a shepherd. Both bring an offering from their respective professions. Cain was a man he raised livestock. Abel was a man who farmed. He brought produce. But Cain's offering, flip that. I'm sorry, I had that wrong. Cain is the farmer. Abel is the shepherd. All right? So each of them bring the same thing. It's accurate, though. Each of them bring an offering. Cain's offering of the produce of the field is rejected. Abel's is accepted. The question is why. A lot of people say, well, Cain did not bring an offering from the flock. But that's not what we see where God demanded. What did He want? He wanted the best of what was offered. And He wanted it to be it has to be sacrificial giving. That's why it's called a sacrifice. Not merely just a giving back a portion. The idea of it is a sacrificial thing. So it's less important as to why his sacrifice was rejected than his response to Jehovah's warning. It's like even if he had offered something incorrect, God says, you offered something that I'm not pleased with your offering, but what was the warning? What was the warning? Sin is crouching at the door. Watch out that it doesn't what?
Rule over you.
What's that?
Rule over you.
Rule over you. Okay. So He says you made an error in bringing me what you brought me, whether it was just simply a poor representation of his crop, whatever it may be. The problem was that he did not want Cain to fall into sin. All right. I like this idea of personification. Sin crouches at the door. We read that all through Scriptures, especially in the Hebrew, because the Hebrews were very good at word pictures. So you look throughout all of the writings of the Old Testament, and there's lots of really interesting wordplay when it comes to Hebrew. So it's the idea of this personification of sin. It's not a passive thing. It's an active. It's an aggressive thing, right? All right. Verse 7, if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. So the Hebrew word for sin is hatat. It's also indicative of a sin offering. And so with that, we can look at verse 7 as simply saying, if you sin, there's an offering for you to make, and you must care about it and offer it appropriately. It's the same way with us today, isn't it? When we sin, there is an appropriate offering. What is our appropriate offering? Our repentance. We come and we offer our repentance to God. And it better be the right kind. All right, it has to be genuine. It has to come from our heart. It has to be with a contrite heart, knowing that if it's not, then God's not going to accept it. You think God can't divine our heart? So, it's like I think I mentioned this, is like telling a child to go say they're sorry. Will they go and do what you tell them to do? Yeah, they'll go and say the words. Is their heart right there? Maybe not at the time. Because they may still think, well, I didn't do anything wrong. And we still tell them, well, you still need to go say you're sorry. I don't know how efficient that is, or the efficacy of asking a child to go do something that they really don't mean. But I think we're trying to get them in the habit of saying they're sorry when they do something wrong. All right? So think about that. If you sin, there's an offering for you to make. And that could be that idea of the sin offering, which would tell us that even the sacrificial system was actually kind of taking shape even as far back as Cain and Abel. And God simply, when he gave the law to Moses, codified that and said, okay, now I'm going to give you this schedule of sins, this schedule of sacrifices. If you do this, then it's kind of like you do a little chart. If you do this, and then you move over, I have to offer a lamb, or I have to offer 2 doves, or I have to offer this, that, or the other. And that's what he did with Moses. He made it where it was easily understood. They didn't have to fumble about thinking, well, I've just got to keep bringing offerings until something works. He said, no, this is what you're supposed to bring. And he made it very clear to them. If you can't afford this, then bring this. If you can't afford this, then you can bring this. But sacrifice must be made. There's got to be something there. All right? But Cain is not listening to this. He's unable to control his evil. He kills his brother. And, of course, Jehovah asks about Abel. He lies. Look at that Adam and Eve's response of truthfulness. He said, who did this? Well, the woman gave it to me. Well, why did you take this? Well, the serpent deceived me. What does Cain say? I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Being deceitful. Certainly deceitful. He knows exactly where Abel is. He's right in the field where he killed him. All right? Cain's response can be read of 2 ways, one of 2 ways. My guilt is more than I can bear, or my punishment is more than I can bear. It kind of makes a difference, right? If he says my punishment is more than I can bear, then Cain still got that simplistic, selfish attitude. The idea of my guilt is more than I can bear, this shows that Cain had a guilty conscience, which he needed to have. He killed someone. First example of murder. All right? Okay, Cain shows despair at being separated by God, and God spares his life from vengeance. It's kind of an interesting thing, the idea that if he went abroad, there may be somebody out there that wants to take vengeance for Abel. I think that absolutely 100% shows that there are other people living out there in the world, and the word certainly would get out there that Cain had been responsible for killing his brother, which even back then was sort of anathema. You certainly didn't kill family members. So, fratricide, I think, is the killing of your brother or sister, whatever that may be. Why does God spare Cain from death? The same reason that he didn't kill his parents, right? God is a merciful God. He's merciful. He's merciful even to Cain. With the horrible sin that he committed, he is still merciful to Cain. But there is a punishment, right? He's going to be a wanderer and a nomad. What was he before? He was a farmer. You can't be a nomad and a farmer. It just doesn't work, right? So one of the reasons that people started making cities and civilizations is because the idea of farming and the idea of agriculture. That's why people quit wandering. So can't do what he used to do. He apparently was fairly good at it. Now he can't do that anymore. All right, Cain goes away. Marries and establishes a city. We talked about where does his wife come from. Successive generations from Cain's line produced even greater sinfulness, which ended up being, of course, Cain's sinful behavior. It looks like led to an understanding as we go through and we see his family line, it becomes worse and worse and worse and worse, leading up to, of course, wars and desolation, bloodshed, slavery, all of these things. All right. All of the lines of Adam came to an end with Seth, and his line is the one that makes it through the flood with Noah and his 3 sons. Don't need to get into all of this. It's easy enough to go back. I'm not going to ask all of how many years did he live. It's not really that relevant. Enoch's line ended with Noah. Even though Shem is listed first, rabbinical literature describes Japheth as being the oldest son. Ham is definitely the youngest. We find that in Genesis chapter 9. Wickedness grows on the earth, goes back to verses 1 through 4. Sons of God took wives of the daughters of men, corresponding to verse 4. I'm not going to ask you who are the Nephilim. We're not really given to know what exactly they are or who they are, but we do know that it's incredibly unlikely that it had anything to do with angels taking wives of men. It just doesn't make any sense with what we understand about angelic beings. Okay, the Noahic narrative, is the account literal or figurative? Well, the inspired New Testament writers understood it to be literal. When God said, I'm going to do this, he did exactly this. There was a man, he had 3 sons, they had 3 wives, he and his wife, and all 8 of them are the ones that are saved through the flood because of Noah's obedience to God. We've got to remember that. It's the point to be made. Why did Noah survive? Obedience to God. Why did Noah survive? Obedience to God. All right. This is important. Blameless in his generation. The clause here is limited. Blameless in comparison to the society in which he lived. Remember, they do not have the law in the sense that Moses is going to have the law, but there was an understanding of God and the behavior that he desired from the people that he created. And in that aspect of it, Noah was about the best you were going to find in that generation, which tells us that the generations were successively getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point that the thoughts of man were evil continually. All right? God says do, and Noah does. The idea of complete and total obedience. 40 days and 40 nights, are they literal or figurative? Certainly there's a figurative aspect of the number 40, but there's no reason to believe that there weren't literally 40 days and 40 nights of rain and floods coming up. No reason to believe anything other than that. Even though 40 is understood a little bit later on as having some figurative power behind it, there's nothing to tell us that it was not literally 40 days and 40 nights. All right. Notice that the 40 days and 40 nights in these examples, Jesus in the wilderness, Moses on Sinai, all of these people, it's never up to the person or people. It's always determined by God. All right. Jesus went into the wilderness to be tested, and he had to go through 40 days and 40 nights of fasting, and then Satan was allowed to come and tempt him. Not before that. Only after that occurred. All right. Let's see. You'll want to know a couple things about the ark versus the type in response to Jesus. Jesus, through the Spirit, preached to the sinful men in Moses' generation. Moses was a prophet. Jesus was a prophet. Sin is referred to as prison. God still wanted men to get on the ark. He made it plenty big that whoever wanted to get aboard, but he knew that it was going to be the 8 of them. There wasn't going to be anybody that was going to come aboard. God was not going to take away the flood, but would make room for anyone who would repent. The idea of the ark as a vessel of salvation: get in the ark, get in Christ. All right, we're not going to go Epic of Gilgamesh. That might be a multiple, or that might be an extra point question. The Epic of Gilgamesh. All right. So if you want to go back and read that, great. If you don't, that's fine as well. Let's see. Why the flood? God's exacting justice and giving an example for anyone who would want to grow close to him. After it was all said and done, all the sinfulness had been washed away. That's the idea of the sinful corresponding, not the washing away of the filth of the flesh. That's the idea that God wiped away the sinful flesh off of the earth and completely destroyed it. And now mankind is back to serving God and God alone. All right, covenant God establishes with Noah. What was Noah's part of the covenant? What necessitated that covenant? He would never again, destroy the world. I'm sorry, did you want to take a picture of that?
I got it.
Okay. What was Ham's sin? Why was Canaan the son cursed? We talked about that. We know what Ham's sin was. We know what he did. So that's all that's going to be required of that. Anything other than that is conjecture. Why Canaan was cursed. We think we know, but why? Let's see. Continuing on. Tower of Babel. The Hebrew word is pronounced Bavel, confused, closer to Babel. Josephus Flavius credits Nimrod as having instigated the building of the tower. If his reputation is accurate, it was likely done with slave labor. Nimrod was a wicked man. And now we use the word Nimrod to describe a doofus. Right? That guy, he's a real Nimrod. Well, I hope not, because Nimrod's not a good guy. He was an evil man. He did evil things. So, I don't know if that's intentional or not. What were the sins of Babel? So you need to remember, what were the sins of Babel? What did they do? They decided that they were going to build this thing that was going to reach up to God, reach up to the heavens. I'm sorry, not to God. Hey, the world's flooding again. They didn't understand. They rejected why it was flooding in the first place. Now, if the waters come, we've got this big tower that we can all kind of pile into and go up. One of the things he says, I want you to disperse, go out, and they did not go out. That was one of the big problems in Genesis 11:4, lest we be scattered. And God said, no, I want you to be scattered. He's like, well, you don't want to be scattered. He said, well, okay, then I'll scatter you. All right? God's will be done. Pride of life. Let us make a name for ourselves. So just be aware of some of the things about the Tower of Babel. Timeline. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. The curses of Genesis 3. I might ask you a couple things, not specifics, but some general ideas about the different curses of Genesis 3. What he says for each of these people to do. All right. His curse of Adam, his curse of Eve, and his curse of the serpent. All right. So now we got the rise of Abram. You need to remember, God did not call him out of Ur of the Chaldees. He had already left. His father Terah had already packed up the family, possibly due to seeing the wickedness of the Babylonians. And it's time to get out of here. It could be that there was maybe a little bit of persecution of anyone who believed in the one true God and the mention of the one true God. So Terah gets his family up, they go out, and they settle in Haran. This includes Terah, Abram, Sarah, Lot, servants and goods. But then God calls Abram. What time is it?
7:02.
It's what?
7:02.
All right, well, let's stop for just a second, and then we'll get back into it. I didn't know I'm not paying any attention to the time. Let's break for about 10 minutes, and then we'll get back into it. All right, let's go ahead and get started. That way, I think we might be able to finish up with this review before class gets out. God calls Abram. Abram has already left. He and his father and his family have already left Ur. They are settled in Haran. And God calls Abram out of his father's household, not out of a city. He calls him out of his father's household. He's going to separate him from Terah. Now, part of that is that God had not spoken to Terah. He did not have the kind of one-on-one relationship that God's going to have with Abraham. There's something specific about Abraham that he is going to do. It doesn't mean that Terah is excluded from any of this. It simply means that there's something that Abram at this point, is going to do specifically for God. It does not mean that if you were a believer that you no longer had access to God. It simply means that Abram is going to fulfill a purpose that God has in mind. We're not really even given to know specifically what the criteria was. Why did God choose? We're given to know why He chose Noah. He says Noah was a blameless man, righteous in his generation. But He just calls Abram and says, hey, this is what you're going to do. Now, I think part of what we understand is with Abram's response to God, we understand a little bit about why God chose him in the first place. But not specifically, just simply but what we understand. Because we see that Abram makes a mistake after mistake after mistake, but he does not leave off serving God. He doesn't leave off doing what God tells him to do. So I think that's part of how we understand why God chose Abram over everybody else in the world. Everybody else. Okay? All right. So, God, remember, they don't make a covenant or sign a covenant. They cut a covenant. And we talked about that, I think, last week, the idea about why we cut a covenant, because it typically had something to do, there would be a cutting, whether it was the sacrifice of animals. And we do see that a little bit further on, where I believe it's Isaac makes a covenant with Abimelech, and he brings out these animals and sacrifices these animals. It's like it's a monument. It's a relationship between the two. Or it could be the cutting, the idea of, I don't know, did anybody ever do be a blood brother when I was a kid? The idea of you two friends, they'd be blood brothers, and they'd cut that thing. Man, it was always the first guy who'd cut his hand, and the other guy's like, man, I ain't doing that. So here you have this guy, and he's bleeding from his hand. It was never any more than a scratch. But this idea, that's been going on for generations and centuries, the idea of a blood covenant. But anyway, God cuts his first covenant with Abram with the land promise in chapter 12 and verse 2. It is we need to remember this, it is a suzerainty or a sovereignty covenant. It is from a superior to an inferior. God is, of course, the superior here. He offers this covenant, and Abram has to either accept it or reject it. He has no standing to alter it in any way. He can't go back and say, well, you know, Lord, you said this, but what about this? That's why his bargaining with God over Sodom was not a covenant. It was merely an agreement. If this happens, will you do this? And he had the right to go and ask. You know, hey, if you've got 50, what if you got 40? What if there's 30? What if there's 20? What if there's 10? That's not a covenant. The covenant that God offers to Abram is that I will be your God, and then I'm going to do this for you. All right? So at this point, though, Abram is 75 years old and childless. There's nothing with which to hang your hat on this nation. Where are all these kids going to come from? I said, well, I've got that. I'm taking care of that. My question is, are you going to accept my covenant? If you do, then you don't need to worry about anything. I got this taken care of. Now, of course, from this point on, Abram is completely and totally relying on God and gives everything up to God and allows God to do his will and makes no effort to try to help God along, does he? No. Can't quite let go just yet. We talked about that. Is this simply, and this is not to overly criticize Abram, but Abram's been given this promise. But at this point, remember, at this point he has not seen God do the things that he's going to do. He's not seen God act in the way that he is going to act a little bit further on down the road. He merely makes a promise to him. He says, if you'll do what I tell you to do, if you'll get up out of your father's house, if you'll come to this place, I want you to do this. I'm going to make of you a great nation. Your descendants are going to fill like the stars filling the sky. All right? And I'm going to bless those that bless you, and I'm going to curse those that curse you. At this point, he hasn't seen God do some of the signs and wonders that he's going to do a little bit later on. So it's understandable if he says, I hear you, and I understand, and he understands the idea of this monotheistic understanding from his father's house, but right now he hasn't seen the things that God is going to do. And as he sees those things performed, his faith builds a little bit, doesn't it? It grows and it grows and it grows until the point where Abraham could literally be considered a man of faith. He is a man of faith. All right. But at this point, we gotta give him a little bit of slack. 75 years old child. Now he says, "I'm going to make of you a great nation." And Abram understandably saying, "Well, okay, well, how?" All right. We're not going to get into this. This is the two possible family trees. This has nothing really. It was just more of an exercise, mental exercise for us. So Abram does what God tells him to do. He gets up, he gets out of his father's house, leaves his family there. However, he does take someone with him, right? He takes Lot with him. But everybody else, he leaves where they are. He gets up out of his father's house. He sojourns all the way down through. He comes up all the way out of the north, comes all the way down through the length of Canaan before he settles in Shechem. There he builds an altar for sacrifice. And what's happening here is God's taking him through this area, making sure that he's safe, making sure that he's prosperous, but he's showing him what his descendants are going to inherit. He's kind of showing off the territory, so to speak. He's like this cosmic real estate agent. He's like, but look at this. Fertile land, look at this. All of these wells, look at all of this, all this water. And he's kind of showing him through and showing off this beautiful land that his descendants are going to inherit. Now when we see maps of the Middle East, we look at them and we see these tiny little areas of oasis, but with giant areas of desert. And again, biblical archaeologists have shown time and time again that at one point in time, that particular portion of the world was incredibly fertile. There was plenty of green to go around. And it's only in recent centuries that it has become the desert that we, of course, understand it to be. But at one point in time, it was actually lush and it was green, very fertile. And this is what God's showing off. I mean, let's be honest. If God said, "Hey, look at this, the sand dune. This is going to be yours one day." You see, look over here. It's another sand dune. That's going to be yours one day. I can understand where it'd be sort of okay. You may not, but I think Abram is seeing this incredibly beautiful territory, and God's promising it to his descendants. All right, in 12:7, he cuts another covenant with him. This is the nation promise. Not only are you going to have a great number of people, but it's going to be in a territory. It's going to be in this land. There's a physical property, and it is going to belong to your descendants. They're going to rule over it. And they're going to be there because I'm going to bring them to this place. They're not going to, I'm going to go, he's not telling them this specifically, but we read where he makes it clear to them that I'm going to be the one that gives it to you. If you went and tried to take it on your own before I'm ready for you to have it, it's not going to be yours. The evil, the sin of the Canaanites is not yet full. When it's time, I'm going to come and I'm going to get you, and I'm going to take you to this place, and you will receive it because I am giving it to you at this particular point in time. And the sad thing about it is when it was time to do that, he took them and they said, we don't want it. Not yet. They were scared. Look at the inhabitants of the land. They're giants in our, we're grasshoppers in their sight. Even seeing everything, remember when he says they brought out this produce, and they brought all of this, the goods of the land, and it was just astonishing what they were able to accomplish and where they were living, which tells us that it was a good place to be. And even in spite of all that, we had spies, 2 spies that said, we can do this. All we got to do is go and take it. God said to go do it. Let's go do this. What are we waiting on? But you had the other spies that said, we can't do it. And one of the problems with listening to the majority is oftentimes we make huge, huge mistakes. I mean, how many times have we seen that, right? Hey, we can do this. And you have a majority of the congregation that says, yeah, we've tried that before and it didn't work. Or, we don't have the manpower, we don't have this, we don't have this. And God's saying, look, I'm telling you, if you go do this, if you'll put me first, and you go do this, I'm gonna make you prosper. Maybe not the way that you think, but I'm gonna make you prosper. We did one thing one time, and I'm not gonna get into all the specifics, but we did something in the congregation I was at. And you know what? What we had in mind that would be accomplished by the exercise, it didn't pan out. But man, the congregation was absolutely benefited for having done it in the first place. It brought a sense of camaraderie. It brought a sense of belonging and fellowship. And at the end of the day, God's name was put out there. The people rejected it. But at the end of the day, we benefited from having done it. But if we had listened to some folks, we would never have done it. The majority of the people said, no, it won't work. It cannot. We have tried it in the past and it didn't work. Which is one of the worst reasons in the world not to do something, especially something that would be beneficial to the church and to the kingdom of God. But anyway, all right. So that's. I'm sorry, I got off on a tangent there. So later he moves to Bethel, and it's later called Bethel, and we were going to see that tonight if we actually got into the study tonight. Jacob actually anoints that stone after he saw the vision. He wakes up the next morning, he anoints the stone, leaves it there, the one that he laid his head on. He puts oil on it, anoints the rock, and then he calls it Bethel. At this point, however, it's called Luz. All right. Later it's called Bethel, which is house of the Lord. All right. Famine comes. Abram retreats to Egypt. Who told him to go there? We don't read where God said don't go there. Or stay where he was, but Abram makes the decision to go down into Egypt, and because at that point Egypt's still right there at the land of Goshen, right there at the mouth of where the Nile comes into Egypt, is still very, very fertile. So even in bad times, you could go down to Egypt and they would still have grain, they would still have food, and of course we read that in the account of Joseph, which we're going to get into before too long. But no one told him to go there, but we don't read where God didn't tell him to go there. It's just simply, who told him to go there? Did he make that determination on his own, or did God say something? We're not given to know. Again, he lies about Sarah. We see that where that's passed down to the successive generation. I think this again is the evidence of just it's not a lacking in faith. I think it's an immature faith. I think he believed that God said what he was going to do, but he didn't take into consideration everything that would have to go into that. It was like, he's going to make me a great nation. What does that encompass? It means that this is going to have to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. And I think at this point, he's not thinking about all those things. He's simply thinking, yeah, God said there will be a great nation, but he failed to take into consideration, that means that he's not going to die before it occurs. Right? That would be pretty much impossible. Okay? He didn't take into consideration everything that would be necessary for this covenant to be come into place. All right? God deals harshly with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh kicks them out, not without giving them a bunch of stuff. Likely also that includes the person of Hagar, who would be Sarah's handmaiden. But one thing we know, that Sarah's child could not have come from a heathen king. It was going to come from Abram. So we know if that was never going to occur. All right, her first child is going to be with her husband, and it's going to be when she's much older than even now. Abram, after he's kicked out of Egypt for his misdeed, moves back to the Negev, which is the lowermost part of Canaan. We looked at that on the map. He separates himself from Lot. And unlike what he had the right to do, which is simply say, okay, Lot, you're the younger man, you're under my control, you're going to go over here. He allows Lot to make the first choice. He says, okay, here's the land, you pick which way you're going to go, whatever way you go, we're going to go another direction. Not necessarily in the opposite direction, we're going to go in another direction. So he gives him this first choice as to where he's going to go, and that was very unusual for an older man to do that. I think that part of this is the idea that his faith is coming into its own. He realizes that God is going to make him prosper wherever he goes. So even if he has the absolute worst pasture land, God's like, I'm still going to take care of you. Even if you lost all your pasture land, even if you lost everything that you own, I'm still going to make of you a great nation. You don't need to worry about this. All right. I want you to remember the idea of the forever, a cognitive olam, or age lasting. The idea here is that we talked about there are those who believe, for example, that the Jews still are going to inherit Israel because of the promise that's going to be the idea of to you and your offspring forever. This means age lasting. It means as long as it is necessary and it's good for this to occur, that's how long it's going to be. When it's time that it's no longer necessary or reasonable for it to happen, then I'm going to release it. It's not going to be the case. And we see where they did possess it, because in Joshua it says that everything that God said that he would do, he did. Every part of the land that he said they were going to inherit, they inherited. There was not a bit of the promise left that God did not keep. But we also see where they were taken out of their homeland. So guess what? The age had come to an end. It did not belong to them anymore. And when they came back to a land that while it was their ancestral home, they no longer possessed it in the way that they possessed it before. All right? They were always going to be under the thumb, except for a very brief time where the Hebrew kingdom came back into place, and they actually fought against Rome. They were basically under the thumb of other nations, other empires, so to speak. All right. So yes, it was to them and their offspring forever, or as long as God saw fit to give it to them. All right. War between two groups of kings. This is the idea of the kings of the north and the kings of the south. Kings of the north came up against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah and all of the nations below. Four on top against five. The four on top were, of course, more powerful. The king could simply mean a local warlord, city-state, not necessarily a huge nation. You might find the king of a town. All right, and the king is just simply a title rather than necessarily defining who they are. It's simply, it was king of this. And the idea here is that Abram could technically be considered a king if he had a located kingdom. With everything that he had, he could technically be considered a king. He had enough wealth, enough servants, enough property, animals, all of this kind of stuff. And he had a particular part of the land that literally belonged to him. He could easily be considered a king. But he wasn't. All right. That's the case here. Limited scale, limited soldiers. Abram would probably not have prevailed with a larger force. He decided to do this out of his own volition. God didn't say go get Lot. He decided he was going to go get his nephew and everything that belonged to him and bring him back. Okay, let's see. He had 318 trained fighters, which is a large number of men born in his own home, servants. He didn't have to hire them. They were quick on their feet. They were able to run down the invading forces, which were likely moving slowly due to captives, and probably thinking, "Hey, we won. There's no reason to run. We'll just kind of mosey on back to our kingdoms." And he ended up catching up to him. And what did he? Well, who won? Abram won, didn't he? Put him to rout, destroyed him, and came back with all of the captives. And I'm going to ask this question: what do we do when sin carries off our church family? What do we do when sin carries off our church family?
Go get them.
That's right. We go get them. We drag them back. If they don't come back, it's going to be because they fought us tooth and nail to keep from coming back. But we don't simply watch and wave and say, well, I hope everything turns out well. That's a sinful attitude. We need to have the choice to go, or make the choice to go and grab them and bring them back. Sometimes kicking and screaming. I've had that happen. We got a brother back one time, and he fought tooth and nail. Pride more than anything else. It was just a sense of pride. And once God humbled him, he realized very quickly, and he got his attitude straight. And I realized he wasn't really mad at me. Well, he might have been mad at me. Think about it. He might have been very mad at me. He got over it, though. That's the important thing. All right, Melchizedek, king of Salem, comes out to greet him. And he is as the scripture says, he is a king of who?
Righteousness.
King of righteousness. He is a priest of who?
Peace.
Who's he a priest of?
Oh, priest.
He's a priest of who?
God.
The Most High God. All right? Who is the Most High God? He's not a priest of some pagan cult. He is a priest of God. He is a priest of Jehovah God. How did that work? Don't know. But there's obviously a code of conduct that he would be considered a priest, and that he would be able to come out and he would have tithes offered to him. So what that entailed, I don't know. And anything that you read that suggests it is conjecture, because we don't know. He was certainly not a priest after the order of Aaron, was he? He was a priest before there was a literal priesthood in the sense of the law of Moses. But he was a priest, because that's what the scripture says that he was. So what were his duties? What were the things that he did? We don't know. But we do know that he came out and he blessed Abram and he received tithes. That sounds like a priest to me, doesn't it? Okay. But we need to be careful that we don't read too much into it, that we understand something that we really don't understand. All right. He is a type of Christ. He is king of righteousness, Hebrews 7:1, like Christ is. King of peace, Hebrews 7:2. He brings bread and wine as a symbolic offering. He's unlike Jesus in that we know Jesus had a father and mother. He had a definite beginning. We know when he was born. Melchizedek, we have no idea. He certainly had a father and mother because he's a man. So he was a man that was born of woman, but we just don't know through what lineage did he come? Where did he come from? Did God pick him out as he did Abram and say, I want you to be a priest for me? We don't know. We don't know. Like I said, if we say we do know, we don't. Beware of people who say, oh yeah, but we know this. Well, we don't. What they're typically pulling from is extra biblical sources. The idea of Josephus Flavius, because he will talk about some of the mythology of the Jews, that Melchizedek was this. All that is exactly what we are warned against. Do not be caught up in what? Mythologies. Do not be caught up in Jewish myths. The early church was told that. Don't be concerned about that, because we can't. There's no way of proving any of it. All right. Abram offers tithes to this Christ. He is a type of Christ. The inferior offers to the superior. Right. We offer to Christ. Abram offers to this Christ, Melchizedek. Melchizedek is both priest and king. Jesus is both priest and king. Melchizedek blesses Abram. Christ blesses us. All right. So the idea of a type. Now I might ask a couple of questions about the idea of what is a type, how does that correspond? Give me an example of a type, antitype, and give me plenty of examples of that. A king is grateful for Abram's intervention. He gives them the goods if they can keep the captives. Abram, however, says, I don't want anyone to think that you've made me wealthy. I don't want any of it. I don't want any of the spoils of war. He wants the men that were with him, give them their share. Okay? And then their food. Okay? The food that they expended. But Abram himself wants absolutely nothing of it. He doesn't want anybody to think that this pagan king, remember this king, he was not a righteous man. The only reason he went after him was because Lot was with him. And that's the only reason that Abram got involved in this at all. This king was a wicked man. Okay, so there's no love lost. They're not forming some sort of alliance or even some sort of an understanding. It's like, look, give me my people, give these guys their fair share, and then I'm going back over here where I was before my nephew got kidnapped. Let's see. Abram has everything except an heir born to him, specifically to him, in his own house. This heir is not going to be an adopted son. It's not going to be a servant. It's going to come from within his own home. All right. Vision of the future. Genesis 15, verses 12 through 16. His offspring will be sojourners. That's who they're going to be. And they will be sojourners until the nation promise is inherited. 400 years in captivity. There's going to be a judgment on the nation where they are sojourning, which is Egypt. The 12 plagues, each of them corresponding to a false god of worship, which is an interesting study. If you ever get a chance to look at that, all of the plagues correspond to the gods. The Nile was a god. Now they worshipped it as a god. They gave sacrifices to Nile. And there are many who believe that this is part of the Pharaoh's commandment that the children of the sons of Israel, or the Hebrew children, to be thrown into the Nile. The idea that it's offering up a sacrifice. All right. They're going to come out with great possessions, people, livestock, spoils from the Egyptians. We said, the Egyptians came out and were pressing gold and silver and clothing into their hands. And then they're going to come into the land when God is ready to exercise judgment on Canaan, because their wickedness was not yet complete. But when it was, that was when God was going to get them. He was going to get them, bring them out, and bring them to this place. All right. In chapter 15, verse 5, God reaffirms the nation promise. And also in 15 verses 18 through 21, he reaffirms the land promise. He also promises, and I think this is kind of nice, I think this is a kind of a sop to Abram. He promises them he's going to die an old man, he's going to die in peace. He's not going to lose his life in illness or warfare or anything like that. He says he's going to go up to your people in peace. You're going to die an old man. Kind of like that's what I hope to go. An old man in peace. Some days feel like I'm closer to it than others. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Verse 6, remember this? Verse 6, it was counted to him as righteousness. What was counted to him as righteousness? His what? His faith, right? His faith that God was going to do what he said he was going to do. That's what's counted as righteousness. None of the physical acts. It was his faith that was counted as righteousness. In verse 4 it says, your very own son shall be your heir. It kind of puts some things to rest. He's worried, where's this going to come from? Where's this heir going to come from? He says, your son, the one from your loins, is going to be your heir. They did not understand that, however, and what do? They decide they're going to assist God. Of course, that results in Ishmael. We don't need to really remember this too much. You might want to look at the idea, was Hagar really a wife? The idea of wife versus concubine. It says that Sarah gave Hagar to Abram as a wife, but she had no right to do that, did she? She had no right to give this girl as a wife to Abram. This was a sinful act. She had no right to do what she did. Much is made about the idea of bodily autonomy, but God believes in bodily autonomy. We have no right to give someone to someone else. This includes the idea of slavery. God had never desired chattel slavery. And the idea of being able to give someone like this is ludicrous. She had no right to do that. And the idea here is that Sarah's faith is not yet strong because she'd been told what's going to happen, and yet she continues in this action. In this question, why would she sell her marriage bed so cheaply? And then, of course, the big question is where, his faith is counted as righteousness, but where's Abram's faith in all of this activity that's going on here? Something to consider. All right, we need to get moving. Hagar has very little choice. She's a servant, has to obey. Sarah's bad behavior is on full display. She looked with contempt on her servant after she forced him to do what she did. Now she's going to look with contempt on her. Her conduct was dishonorable. All right, she finds out she's going to have a child. What does she do? She runs away because Sarah is hateful towards her. Her countenance has changed, and now she's being hateful towards her servant. Hagar runs away. Jehovah sees her, and that's important in this aspect. He sees her. Not just of the idea of noticing something. It's like, oh, there's a girl over there. It's he sees her in what's going on with her. He understands her plight. He understands her issues. And he sees her in her distress. All right? And Hagar, to her credit, understands this and makes, she essentially confesses God. You are a God who sees. You are a God who looks after me. Because what does he tell her? He says, go back. I know. Go back and be in obedience, because I promise you, I will take care of this situation. It's going to be on my timeline. So don't go back and get frustrated. You know, and it's going to be a little while, but I promise you, I'm going to take care of this situation. And the son that's going to come from you is going to be a father of a full nation. I'm going to make sure that you're taken care of, and he is taken care of. And now we're not just going to let you have your baby and then kick you out into the world. I'm going to take care of you. All right. So return and submit, so to speak. All right. Abram is 99. God changes his name to Abraham, which is the father of many nations. He establishes the rite of circumcision, which is a sign of the covenant. It is not the covenant itself. It is a sign of the covenant. That's important. Like baptism is not the covenant. It is a sign of the covenant. If we agree to abide under that covenant, we will do what? We will be baptized. All right. So in this one, how did you come into the covenant? You were born into it. And that's kind of the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, right? The old covenant, you were born a child, you were taught the truth, and then, you were made a brother, and then you were taught the truth. Now you were taught the truth, and then you become a brother. All right. These are the correlations. These are the two covenants. Abrahamic and Messianic, born of flesh, born of water. Become a child, learn the law, become a child. Physical sign of the covenant, and then spiritual sign of belonging. You know, the idea of circumcision was a visual thing. You could tell. And that was one of the ways they could determine who was a child of the covenant. Now, I have no idea. I don't know if you're baptized unless I ask you and you specifically tell me that you've been baptized. So it's a little bit different. Now, under the old one, it was only through lineage. You had to be born into it. But under the new law, all are welcome. Anyone can become a child of the covenant, which is it's why it's a superior covenant, isn't it? The old one was inferior. Doesn't mean that it was bad. The idea of inferior doesn't mean that it was wrong. It simply means it was subordinate. It was temporary. It had specific things that made it not perfected. But the new covenant is perfect. It is literally a perfect covenant. We're not necessarily perfect, but the covenant is. All right? Circumcision, similarities, baptism, you want to know these. Mandatory for males under the old covenant. Today it's mandatory for everyone. That's the thing. Were women part of the covenant under the old law? Yeah, of course they were. They weren't excluded from the old covenant. They merely didn't have that physical sign of the old covenant, but yeah, they were born into it. They were part of the covenant, 100%. Number two, if you did not comply, you were cut off from the covenant. Same thing today. Now, that cut off aspect of it may not take place until this world is no longer. But if you're not under that covenant, if you have not had that spiritual circumcision, you will be cut off. And unfortunately, the vast majority of human beings that have lived throughout the centuries are going to be cut off. And that's sad. But it's just, that's the way that it is. Number three, it did not take the place of obedience to God's commandments. It's the same today. All right? Simply because you were circumcised. And that was the problem, right, with the Jews, because as the centuries went by, they were looking at, but we are what? We're the children of Abraham. We're the children of the covenant. We're the children of the covenant. You don't understand. And he's like, no, there's some things that you're supposed to be doing that you've not done. Yes, you've gone through that physical act, but you're not doing all of the things that go along with it. You're not engaged in the behavior that you're supposed to be engaged in. All right? The differences, of course, for males only under the old law. Now it's for everyone. Number 2 is performed on infant non-believers. Of course, now today, it's performed only on believers, people who are adults and they understand the word. And we've got to remember this, that baptism is not performed on anyone. You don't perform a baptism. Right? Number 3, it's not connected, the old one was not connected with forgiveness of sin. Under the new law, baptism washes away the sin. All right. Renamed Sarai to Sarah, affirms to her, now she understands that the nation promise is going to come to fruition through her offspring and not Ishmael. It's interesting, she wanted so badly for this child, and then when the child is here, and she finds out, well, it's not going to be Ishmael, she really has nothing to do, she wants nothing to do with Ishmael. She's waiting for a chance to get Ishmael out of the house. You know, she does not want her son, she does not want that son, the son of that slave woman will not have a part of my son's inheritance. Well, you gave up your handmaid to your husband for this to have the child so that you could essentially become the mother of that child by proxy. And now when the child of promise is going to come, you want nothing to do with her. You just really put your foot in it, Sarah, didn't she? It doesn't appear that Abraham wants Ishmael to substitute for Isaac, but he is concerned about Ishmael's place when Isaac comes into the picture. He loves this boy. It is part of who he is. It's part of him. There's some of him in Ishmael. And as a good human being and as a good father, he realizes, I'm a father of this child. I have a responsibility to him. But God kind of puts his, don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of Ishmael. Your son, this son that you're going to have, is going to be the child of promise. But I promise to you, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. And he does, as God always does. He promises he's going to make him a great nation, and he certainly does. Abraham obeys God in the institution of circumcision. 99 years old. Man. All the men of the household, to not be circumcised would make them unclean, akin to heathen. And God wants the household of Abraham to be in accordance with his will. He doesn't want any outside influences. So they're all made, they all receive the sign of the covenant, which makes them part of the covenant. Ishmael is circumcised at 13, making him part of the covenant as well. Now, we know that at this point, Ishmael only understands the God of Abraham. That's the only God he knows. But as he leaves, as he's sent away and as he grows, we can't let up too much on this simply because he was sent away to another place. Doesn't mean that God expects him to give up Jehovah and go after these false gods. But unfortunately, that is exactly what happens. He goes and he takes, remember his mom gets a wife from him from Egypt. What are the Egyptians? The Egyptians are pagans. They're heathens. They worship all of these false gods. And Ishmael, rather than remaining true to Jehovah, eventually sinks into idolatry as well as the rest of his descendants. Let's see. Real quick. All right. 3 men that appear to Abraham. This is the Lord and 2 angels. One of them is God in the flesh. Who is God in the flesh? Jesus. It is the appearance of the pre-incarnate Christ, often called a theophany. You don't need to know that, but it's just a cool word. Abraham's, I'm going to ask you to the difference in the hospitality. Abraham's hospitality and the idea of what he's willing to do versus Lot's version of hospitality and what he is unfortunately willing to do to show hospitality to those 2 men. We know that they were physical men because they eat and they drink. They didn't refuse the food. They were able to physically take in that food and drink. 2 reasons. Remember this, 2 reasons for their presence. Number 1, to lend weight to the pronouncement of the coming of Isaac. And 2, what? To give weight to the condemnation of Sodom. All right. He's going to return to him about this time next year. Abraham understands that these men are special. They're not just merely 3 guys. Sarah laughs. Same laugh as Abraham in the last chapter. The same word is given. I like this, though, and we want, just keep this in mind. Is it any more miraculous for a woman to give birth at 90 than a virgin to give birth at all? Both of those are physically, because she says, the way of women is gone. I'm physically not able to have children. And the idea of a woman being able to have children without the corresponding physical aspects of being able to have children, it would be just as miraculous. So I think oftentimes we may not look at that with give that the kind of weight. Now, for men, I think I've heard of men having children, fathering children at 90. It just depends on their ability. But for women, that's just not the way that it goes. Chapter 18, the Lord wants Abraham to know about the punishment of the cities on the plain. This corresponds to Canaan, right? The word had gone out from the Lord that Sodom and Gomorrah were going to be destroyed. He had made that pronouncement. God is going to destroy them due to their sin and as an example to witnesses about His righteousness and mercy, because it's going to be told forevermore. What happened here? Well, the Lord destroyed it. Why did He destroy it? Because it was wicked. And their cities are not to be rebuilt. All right? They were laid a wasteland. Why does God relent when Abraham tries to I hate to use the word bargain, but let's use that word bargain. Why does God relent and say that He will not destroy the city of Sodom if there are 10 people found? Right? Mercy. Mercy. That's all it is. Remember God's mercy. It is paramount. He is not going to destroy them when they have. He has every right to destroy them. Their sin their wickedness was terrible. All right? The hospitality code, sacred duty, nothing was expected or received in exchange for the hospitality. All needs were to be met. And this is the important one because this corresponds to what happened with Lot. The guest's safety was in the hands of the host, and their lives could be forfeit if something happened to that guest. All right? Angels come to Sodom. Lot is sitting in the gates of the city, which means that he has really kind of gone over into being a citizen of this town. He didn't sit in the gates unless the people of the city were willing to let you sit in the gates. You didn't just walk up. And the idea of sitting in the gates, it was not merely walking around and talking. He was a man of respect. He was a man of honor, and he was allowed to sit in the gates of the city. As soon as they walk into town, he sees them. He runs to them, urges them to come to his house. They say, no, we'll sleep in the city square. He knows what the city is like. He basically takes them and steers them into his home. All right, that's important to realize. It wasn't just, I'm offering this as not, no, you need to come with me. He knows what the city's going to be like. This is the difference of hospitality. He was willing to offer up his 2 daughters who were not married, they were virgins, and he was willing to offer them up to the men of this city in order to protect the 2 men that had come into his house. The whole thing was wicked. He had no right to do that at all. Which means that while Lot was righteous in the fact that the sin offended him, he was not righteous in the fact that he was willing to do what he was willing to do. 2 wrongs do not make a right. The men attempt to break in. The angels strike them with blindness. Probably more translated as confusion or disorientation. Not if sheer unable to see it all. It's the idea of it's like you have vertigo and you reach for something. It's like, no, that's not it. Hold on, I can't. You try to reach out and you grab it. That's more likely what it is confusion or disorientation. Angels warn Lot to leave. The family does not believe. He goes and he tries to talk to his sons-in-law. And they think he's joking. Why would look at this city? Who's going to destroy the city? The Lord's going to destroy the city. If they don't know the Lord, then that's not really much of a threat, is it? This God that you don't know is going to destroy the city. Okay, Dad. And they think he's joking. They push him off. They will not leave. So all night, I wonder how many times in tears he's begging these young men to leave their home and come with him and be saved. Man, anybody ever gone through that? Probably so. So anyway, they give him the angels give him all night to try, but then say you've got to leave. Lot resists. He's looking around what he's leaving behind. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he's thinking maybe a little bit more time. I'm going to convince these guys, but he's not going to convince them. So they finally basically force him, like he forced them into his home. They force him out of his home and towards the city gate so he can get out. Let's see. Do not look back. Think about this. Might be on there. Does not merely mean to glance backward and look at the destruction. The idea of do not turn back to or return to. And this is kind of important. The idea of looking back. I think about, the sin that I've engaged in my life. Sometimes retrospection is good. Introspection is good. And I look back, but I have to be careful that I don't look back with longing to go back into that thing. I look back and think, wow, man, I used to be here and now I'm not anymore. I'm so grateful for that. But the idea of looking back here is don't look backward with the thought of going back into where you were. Let's see. The idea of proximity to sin. Would Lot have been in this situation had he remained remained the way he was when he first separated himself from Abram? Probably not. Probably not. But we see here that everything he had was in that city. Everything important was in that city. Let's see. Now I was worried about that. Don't need to know that. Abraham with Abimelech allows another man to take his wife due to fear. His faith isn't quite all there yet, but it gets there. Verse 7, Abraham is called a prophet, but he's not a priest or a king. Even though technically, if he was located, he probably could be a king, but he's not. He's a sojourner. So he's not a king of a particular place. Is God pleased with Abraham's conduct? I think it's reasonable to say no, he is not. He is not pleased with Abraham's conduct. But he's allowing Abraham to do what Abraham wants to do. And when it comes time to pull the reins, he certainly will. But at this point, he's allowing him to do what he's going to do. Sarah becomes pregnant. Sarah gives birth to Isaac. He's circumcised at 8 days old in accordance with the covenant. Isaac is the second son, but he's freeborn. Ishmael is firstborn, but of a slave, so he's not on legal parity with Isaac. They are not equal in the way that the people of that time would even look at them. Okay? Ishmael has already promised an inheritance from God. He doesn't need to worry about any of that, but he does live with them for a period of time before Isaac is weaned, and there's a big celebration that's thrown. And it says that Sarah looked and saw Ishmael mocking Isaac. Not exactly know what that means, but she realizes that the two of them cannot be in close proximity any longer. So he goes, Abraham, he says, send her away, don't worry about it. So he puts her, he puts a skin of water on her, gives her some food, and sends her out into the wilderness. The wilderness here is basically meaning anywhere other than where he is. It's just the wilds. I don't think she was set loose on some sand dune, hoping that she doesn't die of thirst. But she is worried. She's scared. And of course, angel comes back to Hagar and says, don't worry. God's going to take care of your son. So don't worry about this. You could look at Abraham's faith, it being tested, to listen to Sarah and to send, this is his son, remember. While Hagar may not have meant anything to him, Ishmael certainly did. I mean, he loved the son. But God says, look, don't worry about him. Do what she tells you. Do what she asks. And he does. All right? Let's see. I said, remember type and antitype. Let's see. He gave some examples to this. What are some types and antitypes? This is the idea of Isaac as a type of Christ. I might ask a couple things on that, but for the most part, maybe a few things. Not as worried about Machpelah. This is something he wants Eleazar to go and find a wife for his son Isaac. It's echoed later in God's command to the Israelites to only marry from within the covenant tribes, not with the heathen Gentiles. The question is, who do you trust? Do you trust family or do you trust these people? And we see when Esau marries the Hittite women, they were a thorn in the side of Isaac and Rebekah. So this is certainly something to think about. Why were they that way? Why did they make their life bitter? Well, for one thing, they had control over their son. Those two women had control of their sons, and they were Gentiles. They were heathen. So were they possibly dragging Esau away from God? Most likely. Let's see. Not as worried about that. Not as worried about that. The idea of nation is not simply many children. It's a distinctive culture and possibly even a language, and it's known for occupying a specific geographic region. So I might ask you, would this be considered a nation or no? Remember the prophecy? When God gives a prophecy, what's going on? God explains what's going on. There's two nations struggling within your womb. The older will serve the younger. So remember that. They'll be divided. And the idea of born first and firstborn. What were the rights of the firstborn? The idea of the birthright being an extra portion, double portion. You know, you think about a pie. You've got 5 kids. You divide the pie up into 6, and the oldest one, or whoever received that birthright, would receive 2 of those portions. That's just a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's fairly accurate as far as the money being divided up, the goods being divided up. Maybe an example of the birthright being withdrawn or altered. So you might want to think about that. 2 or 3 things from the birthright, maybe 2 or 3 items that correspond to that. Remember that. Think about this, the idea that Esau wasn't holy because he traded something sacred for something that would be eaten up and then passed as waste. The idea that despised it, think about that in regards to the gift of Christ. Do we give that up, that precious gift up? Do we give it up for something that is absolutely of no consequence? That's a good idea to keep that in mind. Esau does this intentionally. Doesn't matter if he was hungry or not. Are we willing to give up Christ simply because the situation at the time is untenable? No, we don't. I think, folks, that's about it. Isaac gets blessed the same way as his father did. He multiplies him. And, all right. What was the significance of being a sojourner?
You don't have a house.
What's that?
They don't have a house.
Yeah, they don't have a permanent dwelling place, right? How does that relate to us? We're sojourners, aren't we?
Yeah, this is not our home.
Yeah, this is very temporary. Very, very temporary. Most of us won't even be alive as long as Abraham was alive. And he was a sojourner his entire life. So, you know, actually that's not too bad a way to think about it, is it? Okay, that's it, folks. We only went through chapter 26. Anybody got any questions? Do we need to go back? I was just trying to get through because we are running out of time. They don't want to keep us any later. They wouldn't have that like that. So it's 8:03. Anybody got any questions? All right, very good. Thank you very much, folks. Next week, I made a mistake. I said that next week would be recorded. I misspoke. I will be here next week to teach. It's the week after that I will be at Friedhartman for lectureship. So next week we'll have class, and then I will send out the next class before I leave out of town. So you'll have that before the weekend. And that's it. Thanks. Appreciate it, everybody.